Welcome. Every month NOAA issues a global climate report, and this video is a summary of the September 2019 report. Let's do as we always do and take first of all a look at temperatures. Globally, September was the warmest September on record. Land, it was the warmest September on record. Ocean was the second warmest September on record. The Northern Hemisphere was the warmest, and the Southern Hemisphere was the seventh warmest. And that all sums together to make, as I said, globally that September 2019 was the warmest on record, with an average of 0.95 degrees centigrade above the 20th century average. That makes it 416 consecutive months with temperatures above the 20th century average. Well, how were those temperatures distributed across the globe? You can see that there's only one really cold area, and that's basically the center of North America, excluding Alaska. Meanwhile, South America, Europe, Africa, Asia and Australia were all well above average. Another interesting thing to note is that there is a mixture of both warm and cold ocean off the South American coast, which indicates El Nino is now in a neutral phase. We'll have more on that later. None of all that tells you whether each one of those temperatures were any form of record. To do that, you have to go to the percentiles map, and here dark blue indicates a record cold, dark red indicates a record warm, and you can see there are only 4 pixels on this map that show something that's much cooler than average, while there's hundreds of pixels showing much warmer than average, and there's 123 record warm pixels on this particular plot. Another way of looking at the temperature records to see whether there's warming or not is to compare the number of daily record highs with the number of daily record lows. In September, there were 7,000 record daily highs compared with 1,000 record daily lows. That's a ratio of 7 to 1 and is much larger than we've seen in previous months. Year-to-date extremes are a little bit more in line with what we've seen before. That is 78,500 record highs and 41,000 record lows. That's a ratio of nearly 2 to 1. I've updated my usual matrix here to include September of 2019. The number in each square represents the ranking over the period from 1880 to the present. And you can see 2019 is the highest ranked September and tied with 2015. It looks as though 2019 may well become the second warmest year on record. We should not just be concerning ourselves with the surface temperatures, we should also be looking at altitudes higher in the atmosphere. Here I'm comparing the results from the University of Alabama Huntsville with those of remote sensing systems for the lower troposphere. That's an altitude on average of about 4 kilometers. Both agree that it was the warmest September on record, and there's fairly close agreement in the amount of warming there's been. But the trend is about 0.16 degrees centigrade per decade, which is a little bit lower than the surface temperature, but still quite a considerable warming trend. Next we'll go higher to the mid-troposphere at about 7 kilometers. Again, both groups agree that this was the warmest September on record, with an overall trend of 0.15 degrees centigrade per decade. Again, very similar to the lower troposphere. Lastly, we take a look at the oddball stratosphere. Now that is cooling. There's fairly good agreement between the two groups, one saying it's the 10th coolest and the other one saying it's the 12th coolest in September of 2019, with an average drop in temperature of 0.25 degrees centigrade per decade. This is the UAH plot of temperature by month over the last 40 years. So this is the so-called satellite data. Now people often say there is no particular trend in this data, but that's untrue. If you do a linear least squares fit to this data series, you see a curve rather like this, which is about 0.15 degrees centigrade per decade. There's a lot of fuss been made about this decline that has happened over the last couple of years, since 2016. But I note the same channels don't pay very much attention to the upward trend that has been over the last year or so. I also noticed when putting this together that there was seemingly a pattern here. There seems to be a short period between two spikes and followed by a long period between two spikes. So the short period is 3 to 4 years, the long period is sort of 4 to 5 years. And this pattern seems to be reproduced, possibly with the exception in the early 2000s, but nonetheless it seems to be a fairly consistent pattern. and I wonder if anybody else has come across this before, because I haven't seen it anywhere. Next, let's take a look at the sea ice situation. First, we'll start in the northern hemisphere, and this is a plot of the area of sea ice in percentage terms, and you can see that we have the third lowest extent of sea ice in this September, and that makes 18 consecutive years where we've had below average sea ice in the Arctic. Next, let's take a look at the southern hemisphere. This was again below average for the 5th year in a row, but it was the 13th lowest sea ice extent, which puts it somewhere near the middle of the pack. So nothing special there. Next, let's take a look at the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. In September of 2019, it averaged 408.55 parts per million. That's an increase of about 3 parts per million over last year. Over the timescale that Keeling curve is being constructed, we've averaged about 1.5 parts per million increase per year. However, in the last few years, we've been more like 2.5 to 3 parts per million increase. So the rate of increase of carbon dioxide is accelerating. It's always useful to know what might be happening as far as El Nino and La Nina are concerned. In the last couple of months, we have been in what's called ENSO neutral conditions, which means we're neither an El Nino nor a La Nina. However, the models were indicating that we should be drifting towards a weak La Nina next year, but they seem to have changed somewhat in the last month, showing that we're probably going to remain in ENSO neutral conditions for the foreseeable future, and perhaps even drift towards a weak El Nino by the middle of next year. We keep hearing how cold it is in the United States at the moment, yet September was the second warmest September on record, with record heat in the south, the central and the Ohio Valley. Large areas of the country were much above normal as well. The only slightly cool area was in the far west. Well, what about precipitation in the United States? We had very dry conditions in the southeast and along the eastern seaboard, whereas it was very wet in the northern tier states and in the west. As far as the tornadoes are concerned, we are hugging pretty closely to the 75th percentile line. That means we're much above average year so far. In fact, we've already passed the average number of tornadoes per year, which is 1,297. Here's NOAA's summary chart for the global climate for September of 2019. You'll see it's dominated by high temperature records around the globe. Also, Australia seems to be having a much below average rainfall for this last September. So that's it for this month. So until next time, goodbye.